It's great to see the Australian
I say.
film Lone Wolf, which I remember seeing, I think it was a couple of years ago now at the Melbourne International Film Festival, is now releasing on TVOD on various platforms. And it's my great pleasure to be speaking to the director and writer of Lone Wolf, Jonathan Ogilvie. Jonathan, welcome to Movie Metropolis.
Thank you very much, Peter. Delighted to be here.
Now, this film has always intrigued me, especially as it's based on a Joseph Conrad novel, The Secret Agent. Uh, Tell me about the background to this. How did you come about the novel and seek to adapt it into this film?
Yeah, so it was like two things converging. I'd been watching all this surveillance on, particularly on the news, and of course you see surveillance. It would always be uh, profile portrait rather than landscape size when they featured it on the news. I was seeing it, and it was, and the surveillance was, because in the past surveillance was some blurry person that you could hardly make out, and then I saw some surveillance, and it was like I could see their eyes, and I could see there's one particular case of a poor Brazilian student that ended up getting tasered by the police, and they'd followed him around all the CCTV footage all around in a Sydney, and he was running, and he was shirtless, and he was in a very bad state, but I could see the fear in his eyes, and I thought, as soon as you can see the fear in someone's eyes, then you can tell a dramatic story. It's all about the eyes, you know. And so that was the starting point. It's like, I think I can tell a film through surveillance. So then it became, what story can I tell? And in actual fact, a friend who's actually Polish, I'd loaned him a copy of The Secret Agent, and he gave it back to me, and he said, make a great film. And it hadn't occurred to me. And then it went, and the two just came together, because in The Secret Agent, of course, it's a Victorian film, but Scotland Yard's finest have all these anarchists under surveillance all the time. So that was the nifty fit between the two ideas, I think.
Uh-huh. How interesting. So tell me about developing then the screenplay, because it is it's sort of a futuristic sort of look at surveillance, etc. And it's a really intriguing story. Tell me about that development process.
Yeah, so it was really, once I had the raw material, raw story material, if you like, then it was a question of, okay, how can I play a Victorian novel, albeit considered to be a modernist novel, which is a good starting point, because Joseph Conrad, arguably one of the first, at least English modernists. So good starting point. So it had a contemporary feel to it, and he writes very cinematically anyway, particularly in that book. And there's actually the introduction of Winnie, the protagonist, is like is described as you would describe it in a screenplay, you know. So he's writing very filmically anyway, which makes it easy to adapt. But then I'm starting to think, okay, I can't telling the whole story through surveillance of control, which would be the 45-degree angle of that we're used to, the CCTV surveillance, is not going to be intimate enough. So I introduced this element of Stevie having his own phone camera, was an idea of getting into subjective surveillance, what's known as mutual monitoring surveillance, which everybody's doing. Everybody's filming each other on their phones and sending them out to the world. So
Mm.
that was, so in a way, the challenge was to find all these ways that I could actually put people under surveillance without it feeling too too egregious, I suppose, in terms of what we of how to, you know, how to put everybody under surveillance. But the fact is, everybody is under surveillance right now. I mean, that's you know, that's the cruel irony of it. Everyone is walking around with a film camera in their pockets, incredibly, and everybody is putting everybody else under surveillance. And it's a bit like, you know, if you buy a red car, you see all the red cars on the street. When I was started to look into the surveillance, of course, everywhere I'd look, I was seeing surveillance cameras. They're everywhere. You take them for granted.
Well, certainly the film has a strong Big Brother feel about it, that Orwellian sort of aspect that we're being watched all the time, as you've been describing. And I found the way the story develops, which is somewhat elusive because it never very clearly pinpoints, I suppose, the the malevolence that is going on behind the scenes, and what the real problems are about a group that has been identified as perhaps being a bit doubtful and that sort of thing. So I found again that quite intriguing, because it's a paranoid thriller for our times, I suppose.
Yeah, and once again, I'm kind of taking the beats from Conrad as well, because the it's a bit of a bit of a trick of the secret agent, in fact, presents itself as an espionage book, but if you drill down a little bit and you read it closely, you realize it's a domestic drama. It's the protagonist is absolutely Winnie, whereas it's set up, and this is when he was writing it, the expectation was that he had to write something that had an espionage uh, element to it. That was what was selling. So, in a way, what he's done is he's smuggled the domestic element through the book, which is the same way that I'm doing it. And the film plays in two acts, and the first act, most of it is all the mechanism is actually really revolving around Conrad Verloc. Incidentally, he's called Adolf Verloc in the book, and I said that was one of the parts of the adaptation. It's like, I can't call him Adolf anymore. That's not possible. So of course I borrowed Conrad and gave him the first name of Conrad. So Conrad Verloc, all the mechanisms around the plot are on him, and then she's what I call a submerged protagonist. She comes through and emerges as, particularly in the second half, and then it becomes her story, and that's very clearly what the book does as well.
Okay, really quite fascinating. Now, tell me about the process, because I remember your previous film, Tenderhook, which does go back a few years.
Yes, yes.
And I know how difficult it is to get films off the ground and to get financing and production behind you. How difficult was that for you to be able to actually make Lone Wolf?
Yeah, well, a 12-year hiatus. I'm delighted to say I'm actually in post-production on my new film in New Zealand right now. I'm in sound production on Head South, which is a post-punk coming of age set in Christchurch in 1979. So not such a big gap between the other two. The other two was essentially a bit of a over 10-year gap. This was really about, it was, and it's a solution to a problem. How can I realized that I could tell this story and make it relatively cheap. I think the budget's about $2 million. And the Screen Australia was very proactive in supporting it. It was something that, because it's surveillance, I realized I could schedule it and shoot it in a month. That was a 4-week shoot, and that was possible to do, even though there's a lot of locations. But just the idea, of course, because surveillance doesn't have a lot of angles on it. Surveillance is basically one angle, and so what you have essentially is a bunch of one-act plays. Each scene is a one-act play, which of course appeals to actors absolutely, because they're not being made to repeat and repeat and repeat and remember everything. So it was a gift to the act. I mean, I was fortunate to get a fantastic cast, but part of the appeal, I think, is they didn't have to hit any marks. It's not like they're having to, because I didn't want them to hit any marks. It's surveillance. The surveillance frame is different from the cinema frame. The surveillance frame is messy. The cinema frame is always, the actor's always hitting the right mark and in the key light. And I didn't want that, of course, for surveillance. So that freed up the actors absolutely, to a point that actually Tilda was acting in a scene. We'd done about 4 takes. And then she said, "Oh, that's where the camera is." Because we had the cameras all sort of hidden away like surveillance. So she didn't even know what camera to be performing to, which of course is very freeing for an actor. It sort of becomes like a performance in the round, if you like.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And we'll get to the actors in a moment, but I just wanted to ask about using Melbourne locations because I recognised some of them, and I think that that was really interesting too.
Yeah, it was very interesting for me because initially I had kind of conceived it to be made in Sydney, and I'm sort of going, are there anarchists? Do these people actually kind of exist? And is this world? And then I landed in Melbourne. I landed in Collingwood. All I saw was anarchist posters all over the place. I went, okay, so this is the home of this film, absolutely. So that was a joy, and the key bookshop was this great Victorian shop front that is not a million miles away. It's actually basically exactly the same shop as described in the novel because it's a Victorian building. So that was great, and just to be able to use Melbourne, a little bit of the underside of Melbourne, I think. I mean, you might have you recognise lots of the places. It's not, but equally there's the Yarra, there's the Princess Bridge. There's a lot of iconic places in that. St Kilda, of course, as well.
Yes.
Places I love in Melbourne. Yeah.
Okay, which works well in a thriller like this. So you've mentioned Tilda Cobham Harvey, who of course is terrific, as is Chris Bunton, I must say, in his key role, Josh McConville. Of course, Hugo Weaving in a small but pivotal role, and Diana Glenn. And Stephen Curry.
Mm.
So you really have put
Mm.
together a great cast, and I suppose getting them all in that short time period, as you say, in 4 weeks, was quite an achievement.
Yeah. Well, it was one of those ones. It's as soon as you offer a different approach to a film, you read the script. The script was. I've been fortunate to work with great actors all the way along, and I think they responded to the script. Hugo particularly intrigued by how it actually might work. This idea that there's no expectation of performance because you're not supposed to be, not aware. And the truth is, there's at any most films are at some point, as I say, they hit the mark. They're in the key light. There is a sense of performance.
Mm,
This is the performative side of it is absolutely reduced here because
mm,
we're not. It's not the primary. As I say, the surveillance frame based on it's untidy, but it's also interesting. It's based on nothing happening, whereas the cinematic frame is based on action. It's based on things happening. Surveillance frame, you don't want things to happen because then things are going bad. So that's actually the basis of a surveillance frame is that anybody looking at they're hoping nothing will happen, which of course becomes the interesting idea about surveillance because as soon as we see surveillance, we're already triggered to know that something bad has happened because otherwise it wouldn't exist. It would have been recorded over. So that's in a way interesting itself that you're actually looking at the past in terms of looking at surveillance. It's not necessarily in the eternal present, which drama is. It's set up as a recording of an event, which is interesting in itself in terms of the temporal placement of it.
it is. It has that sort of multi-layer approach that you can look at as a narrative from different perspectives, which I found so interesting and quite different from, I suppose, mainstream Australian drama. And I suppose that's what attracted also the Myth Premier Fund. I think they were part of it
Yep.
too. Yeah, and go
Yep,
on.
they,
Yep.
they were very supportive of it, so that was fantastic. It got a bit lost in the COVID and the lockdowns, unfortunately, but
Yeah.
they were. It was. I mean, the truth is, without Myth, it wouldn't have got up. So that was. I'm very grateful for their support.
Now, I think I read that the film screened at Rotterdam, and I'd be interested in the response that you got from for the film there.
Yeah, well, once again, I would have loved to have said that I walked the red carpet at Rotterdam, but it was right. It was during lockdown. They
Of
were locked
course.
down. It was, but um, great response, actually. Sort of, it's released. It had a theatrical release in America, and we got some very generous response to reviews that said actually makes more. It's more straightforward than the book, which I thought was nice because it's, you do have to pay attention in the film. It does require some sort of, you do have to take things on board. If you go and have a cup of tea, you might miss something. So, but I was actually quite pleased to know that as far as this, and a very eminent reviewer actually was saying it was much more. I had managed to make it more understandable than Joseph Conrad had, which is something of a compliment, I must say.
It is, and yeah, that's terrific. But the cinematic form, in many cases, will do a lot more to a novel or to the written word, and that's certainly what you've done in Lone Wolf. Tell me now about the process, because the film is releasing on TVOD and on various platforms. How is that working for you at this stage?
Yeah, I think well, I think it seems to be people seem very excited about the idea. I mean, cinema. I'm sometimes thinking, okay, maybe going to the cinema, maybe cinema was. This is going to depress everybody, including you, Peter. But maybe cinema was the greatest art form of the 20th century. We're only shortly into the 21st century, but that doesn't mean that stories aren't going. Well, the actual act of going to the cinema, I should to qualify that. People are. There'll always be these stories, and I think it's a great option to watch. It plays well on the little screen actually because it's surveillance. It works well on the big screen, the little screen. But the easiest way to look at it is to go on our website, which is Lone Wolf the Film, not the movie, lonewolfthefilm.com, and then that will link you directly to a number of platforms where you can watch it.
Okay, excellent. Now I'm quite intrigued. Can you say a little bit more about the film that you're doing post-production on, Head South, I think you said?
Yes. So this is a post-punk coming of age set in 1979 in Christchurch, and it stars Ed Oxenbould as a 16-year-old young boy who's sort of stuck with his world-weary father, played by Martin Sokos, and he discovers the wonderful world of post-punk music. And yes, to answer your next question, Peter, it's very autobiographical. And, that's where I grew up, and that's where I'm back to something of the eternal return, as Freud would say, back here making this film. But it's been a delight to make. We shot it last year, and it also stars Stella Bennett, who's better known as Benny, who's a singer-songwriter, who's only had, it still boggles my mind, 4 billion streams of her song, 4 billion streams. And I just think, well, there's 8 billion people in the world. That's quite I can't quite figure those. Anyway, it's her first film. She's terrific in it. All the performances are incredible. So I'm really excited to be bringing that to the people.
When are you hoping to have it released?
I'm in sound production at the moment, sound editing. So I think it probably won't come out until next year, but either hopefully end of this year, early next year, ideally.
Okay, sounds interesting. Look forward to it. So, Jonathan, I'm quite intrigued. What is it that sparked your interest in being a filmmaker, and obviously spending a fair bit of time developing films as well?
Yeah, well, it sort of goes back to my love of music, particularly post-punk music, and I started making music videos for Flying Nun, which is a very well-known music label from this side of the world. And then what really cemented it, I think, was going to London and working. I worked on Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, which was a great honor and a great thrill, and that really made me think I wouldn't mind doing that. That was the one. I worked on a few other feature films, but of course that was the one that really got me excited about the possibilities of film, of course. him being perhaps the most successful art director ever. I would suggest. His films were incredibly successful. They're all art films, um, and they're all done on big budgets, and they all did very well. So that in itself is a fascinating. He didn't make things particularly easy for audiences. And I love the quote. I often use the quote. My favorite quote of Stanley Kubrick is, "The audience doesn't know what it wants because they haven't seen it yet," which to me is the answer that flies in the face of you get triangulated by Netflix, and they tell you what you watched last month. They don't tell you what you want to watch next month, and that for me is the key to the evolution of cinema. It has to be something that surprises an audience. So looking through the front windscreen of the car rather than looking in the rear vision mirror.
How intriguing. And Full Metal Jacket, of course, one of Kubrick's finest films. How hard a taskmaster was he on set and so on? How easy was it to work with him?
Well, he wanted me fired. I unfortunately set fire to Matthew Modine while operating a smoke machine, which
No.
yes, he did actually want me fired at that point. But my boss, because I was working with special effects. My boss said, "Well, this is why I don't like to rush things, Stanley. Because we were shooting Magic Hour, and we were rushing around because the film. If you see the film, there's no. It's all natural light, and it was all done in South London." Standing in for Vietnam, and Beckton, which was a gasworks, which Anton Furst, the designer, was able to blow it all up, and it had this great Art Deco look that looked like Hue in Vietnam, and so they had carte blanche for this, and so we had all this petrol and all these fires, and the only time we weren't allowed to shoot was when the smoke went over the Thames to where Margaret Thatcher lived in Greenwich. And the black smoke, if it's going that way, they had to stop filming and wait until it went the other way to the poor people on the other side. That was okay to do that.
And I'm so pleased to hear that Matthew Modine survived it all.
Yeah, he did. Just a few eyebrows burnt, that's all.
Oh my goodness, that's great. Looks great on the resume. Almost fired by Stanley Kubrick. That's fantastic.
Yes, exactly.
So Jonathan, fantastic that Lone Wolf is now available on TVOD. But I did want to ask you one other question. Have you seen any other films, television programs, streaming, anything of late that has impressed you?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. I've been staying in motel rooms for the last 6 months, and I haven't turned on the television. I'm sorry to
Ah,
say. I've been reading books,
ah,
reading books, always reading books. So nothing that comes to mind. I apologize. I mean,
well,
as soon as we stop talking, it will come to me exactly. But
that's okay.
uh,
Yep, go on.
I'm probably the last thing I saw was Better Call Saul, to be honest, which was actually quite. That had a very surveillance frame in it, which I thought we used as. I thought that was very interesting, the mise en scene of that in particular, and not in a hurry to tell the story, which I thought was interesting. It was because the whole thing about surveillance is that it plays out in real time. Of course, there's no edits in it. You don't, and so that idea of letting things just sit, I was kind of a little quite inspired by Better Call Saul, and that fact that Vince Gilliam, the creator, is bold enough to let things just play out, whereas we often there's this fear, and particularly at the beginning of films, is like, well, they're going to switch the channel if we don't give them some action quickly. But I just really love those moments where you can sit in a situation.
Terrific. We've been speaking to Jonathan Ogilvie, who's the writer-director of Lone Wolf, now available on various platforms, TVOD, etc. And you heard the website, and looking forward to Head South coming up soon too. So, Jonathan, thank you so much for talking with me.
It's been a pleasure, Peter. Much appreciated.
Thanks again. All the best.
Okay, bye bye.
Okay, bye bye.